My name is Paul Kaplan. In this talk we will depart for a while from the situation in South Africa and return to the matter of Judeo-Christian alliance. We can no longer ignore the deteriorating condition of the Christian faith, because its collapse is leaving a vacuum that is being filled by the lunatic leftists throughout the world. The Christian religion is rapidly becoming so corrupt and useless that tens of millions of Christians are walking away from this rotting mess every year, precisely as Jesus predicted they would. And we Jews are also stuck with the junk religion created by the Pharisees over 2,000 years ago, despite the national efforts to prevent it. So let's see where we went wrong and how to fix it. Well, at the outset, Moses had to find a way to hammer the spirit of the Ten Commandments, also known as the covenant, into the people. And he found this job so frustrating that he frequently wanted to give up altogether. And his main method of teaching the Ten Commandments consisted of a simple set of lessons explaining the purpose behind each commandment. And this simple set of explanations was known as the oral law. Now, it was necessary for the Levites to be very well trained in the oral law, because they were the ones who had to hammer the covenant values into the people. So Moses ordered the training to be given verbally and face to face by the elders. And this method worked perfectly. It worked so well that the Levites understood precisely what they had to achieve, and they managed to establish the basic principles of godliness, discipline and decency amongst the people more successfully than it had ever been done before and has ever been done since. But there was one thing that the Levites were expressly forbidden from doing. They were not to write down the oral law under any circumstance. That was the big no-no. Don't write down the oral law. Writing down the oral law was strictly forbidden because Moses knew that their writings would lack the necessary wisdom and overview, and would very soon expand into a huge ocean of inferior rubbish that would destroy the power and clarity of the Ten Commandments. That was what he was worried about. And the Ten Commandments were the covenant that Israel had vowed to uphold. But tragically, some rabbis became corrupt, and they disobeyed the sacred rule not to write down the oral law. And when these corrupt rabbis, known as Pharisees, defied this crucial instruction, their writings did indeed grow into the huge sea of rubbish that Moses had tried so hard to avoid. And the Talmud became known as the Sea, because it had no major rules like the oral law, but consisted only of minor rabbinical rubbish. Now, this gigantic sea of garbage, which today consists of about 75 encyclopedia-sized books, is all that remains of the crystal clear oral law devised by Moses to teach the covenant. So the Pharisee rabbis began to teach their own Talmudic rubbish to the people. And this gigantic collection of fine print and rabbinical trash destroyed the covenant and the Jewish idea of right and wrong for centuries, just as Moses knew it would. And to this day, our synagogues cannot and do not instruct us in the basic rules of right and wrong. All we get from our rabbinate is the blathering rubbish that prevents us from knowing right from wrong and causes us to confuse leftism with godliness. So why did the Pharisees and their Roman accomplices commit this frightful crime that broke the covenant? Well, because the Talmud is so gigantic, it enabled them to create a huge Talmud educational racket that yielded enormous sums of money. And the beneficiaries were not only the rabbis in Israel and their Roman friends, but some of the spoils went all the way up to senators in Rome. So when the Pharisee rabbis began to preach this Talmudic rubbish mingled with the genuine Torah, They bored the people to tears and caused them to altogether lose interest in the covenant and all the values it preserved. And this brought upon the nation the terrible curse written in Deuteronomy 28:15. Look it up for yourself. And even though the nation has managed to fight its way back into the promised land, we are still, to this day, without our covenant. And we still lack the moral fiber and moral certainty that raised us on high in the first place. So naturally, when all this happened, many people were horrified at what the Pharisees were doing, and a large part of the nation rose up to try to prevent this catastrophe. And tens of thousands of people were slaughtered without mercy. But the greatest and bravest of all these defenders of the covenant was a young man by the name of Yeshua. His name was Jesus. And he fought the Pharisees mainly by preaching the ancient oral law, the Moses way. And his superb oratory attracted a huge following of his own Jewish people. But the Romans were watching, and they also understood the power of what Jesus was saying. And the Romans saw that they could use his teachings with a few changes to create a gigantic new religion among the Gentiles. And this new religion would be 100 times the size of Judaism and would generate money and power beyond anything in human history. They had already made a huge fortune from milking a small nation like the Jews. So how much better could they do from a Gentile following 100 times the size of Israel? And Jesus could see precisely what they were going to do and how successful the new religion would be. But he also knew that the Romans would have to build in some differences from Judaism. And he saw that these differences contained weaknesses that would eventually destroy the entire gigantic religion. And he described this eventual collapse as the period when the days of the Gentiles are fulfilled, as he put it. So the days of this Roman-created Gentile religion are now fulfilled, as predicted by Jesus, and nothing can save it. And from now on it will receive nothing but scorn and derision until it disappears altogether. And Christians will have no option but to return to the teachings of Jesus, which are nothing other than the ancient oral law of Moses. In other words, Jesus taught the covenant. So how are we to know when this process is starting? Well, keep your eyes on the Jews, because the best and brightest of the Jews are about to comprehend that our trusted rabbis are actually the intellectual descendants of the Pharisees, who caused the breach of the covenant in the first place and brought us down. And the best and brightest will also realize that our trusted rabbis are the descendants of the Pharisees, and their stinking Talmud is the legacy of those horrible people. And then we'll realize that our horrible rabbis have been preaching their damnable rubbish and twisting our thought processes for 2,000 years. And these same scurvy rabbinical swine have turned us into the most spineless and hated nation on earth. Having taken away the moral fiber and the nobility we got from our simple and powerful covenant, these rabbis of ours have turned the majority of Jews outside the state of Israel into weak, slack-handed, and contemptible leftist cowards and liars. And worst of all, they've managed to persuade us that leftism is the same as godliness. Now, in the very near future, the best and brightest Jews will comprehend what our rabbis have done. And the furious confrontation predicted by Jonathan, or the Apostle John, in Revelation 12, verse 7, look it up for yourself, will begin. And the Christians will not be able to stay out of this furious internal Jewish war, because they will understand at long last what Jesus was trying to do. And they will very soon see how to revive their dying churches by applying the instructions of Jesus. And when all of this takes place, then Jews and Christians will finally realize that there's actually no theological disagreement between us, and that we have to unite into a mighty power that will rescue Western civilization from the clutches of the left. And furthermore, this enormous theological revolution will so greatly strengthen God-fearing people that after annihilating the left, they will then be able to establish the golden millennium promised in Scripture. Now, these matters are dealt with in chapter and verse in the book God versus the Left, which you can get by clicking on the book icon on any page in this website. So this is Paul Kaplan signing out and thanking you for your time and attention.